In Top Talkers today, the Quebec government has introduced a new initiative that encourages cabinet ministers to speak only French to their counterparts from other provinces and here in the federal government as well. Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Alexandre Cloutier told a news conference yesterday that Quebec's initiative to limit English usage by its ministers is only a guideline, not a restriction. On our panel today, Rick Gibbons from CFRA. Good morning to you.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to respond unless you say that.
I'm sorry. Fine then. Alison, Sandor from CFRA as well. And we also have Connie B from Majic 100. I want to start with you, Rick. How do you feel about this?
Well, you know, it's just another irritant that the separatist government is intent on introducing to try and, you know, upset. They're just looking for friction with the rest of Canada. And they use that as a sales pitch back to the Quebec people. I think, though, I think it serves a positive purpose. It's a perfect illustration of what could happen if you follow the separatist agenda, which is provide less language training to young Francophone Canadians and make sure that they remain insular and trapped in their own province, unable to communicate in a wider world because their government thought it better that they speak only French and not have a bilingual capacity that will open up an entire world to them in their careers.
Excellent. I think we're going to come back to a portion of what you just said there. Alison, I want to ask you about how you feel about specifically the interprovincial discussion, like a minister from Quebec speaking with someone from Alberta in only French. Does this make any sense?
No, and here's the reason why. There's recently talks between Alberta and Quebec to ship some oil over for it to be processed in Quebec. How are they going to do that if they can't communicate with each other? And you can't expect an Alberta cabinet minister or a BC cabinet minister to speak French. So they're going to sit there, have a translator? Here's another, let's say, $100,000 we're spending on a translator?
Right.
And on another level, as a Quebecer, someone who was born in Quebec, God, I live in Ontario. I feel like I've been pushed out, and that's how a lot of people are feeling now. They can't even deal with their own government in the language that they choose, and I thought this was Canada. Guess I'm wrong.
Right, and Connie, maybe let me just try and play the devil's advocate a little bit. Shouldn't we all speak French, it being one of the official languages?
Yes, I think, you know, I mean, my kids are in French immersion, and I think it's great that they learn a second language. I think that only helps them, you know, when they get out into the real world. But I mean, legislation like that, even though it's just a recommendation and they're not enforcing it, it just, you know, all the social media comments yesterday were all the same. It was like, enough already. It's becoming white noise. People are just, like you said, irritated. They're just fed up with all these statements coming from Quebec.
Okay, I want to go back to something that you sort of alluded to, Rick. Is it actually a disservice to the residents of Quebec? This kind of.
Well, I'm looking in sort of the larger symbolic context. I think it is. I think it's trying to send a message to Quebecers that we can survive and prosper and endure by being francophone, and which they obviously Quebecers can and should. But there isn't a wider world that we necessarily need to deal with in future, and I think that's a little off base for them. But I think it just really illustrates the separatist government has been bent on trying to create friction with the rest of Canada because that's its sales point with the rest with Quebec voters. In
the campaign, Marois, did she not state that they would be trying to wrestle control from the federal government?
Well, she said that they would try and wrestle more powers from the federal government, but every Quebec government, federalist and separatist, has always fought that battle. There's no question. But I want to go back to something you asked earlier. You posed the question, shouldn't we all be bilingual? That's not the essence of bilingualism. Bilingualism was never about, and will never be about, making sure every Canadian speaks both official languages. It means, and I think to your point, that we should be able, in either official language, to speak to our government, to have services delivered in the language of our choice.
I think that this is also doing a further disservice to Quebec. I mean, you go to Alberta and you see how people are thought of from Quebec and Alberta. They have very negative thoughts about people from Quebec and Alberta, and this sort of just perpetuates it. So you have someone who maybe wants to move out of Quebec, move to Alberta, and then they're kind of shunned. And I've seen this. I've known people from Quebec who are having a hard time living there and are having a hard time building relations with the other provinces.
Isn't that the idea? If you have a separatist agenda to increase the divide, don't you think that actually would be something that they would be one of the goals to achieve?
Clearly,
right.
Well, it creates the political. It creates the political environment in which you sow the seeds of separatism. And I think they've been very unsuccessful so far. I think Quebecers are past that. I think all Canadians are past that a little bit. And I think they're having difficulty, this separatist government, having some difficulty in finding traction today.
And if you look back at the election, people were so fed up with what the Liberals were doing with all the commissions, with all the corruption. They had to look elsewhere, and that's where they looked. But they have to remember, as a PQ government, they're still a minority. Yes, they're going to push their agenda, but they also don't speak for the majority of Quebecers.
We were speaking about this beforehand. This generated a lot of conversation why we did the Top Talkers on it. And Kurt said, we're not a bilingual country, we're a country with 2 official languages. Do you think it's a disadvantage not speaking French, Connie?
Well, I mean, just go back to my kids. I mean, they're in French immersion just because I want them to have an appreciation for the language and just, you know, just to get by on, you know, to have a conversation. But, you know, I have family that's out in, you know, out west, and, you know, none of them speak French and have no intentions of ever learning how to speak French.
Unless they wanted to work for the federal government.
Yes.
And then it's, I mean, that brings up a whole other issue, right? If we're truly an official 2-language country, and not everybody has to be bilingual, but in fact we get the services in both, it's interesting that the federal government seems to prioritize those who are fluent in both.
To achieve exactly what I suggested, to ensure that you can deliver services in both official languages. On a general note, I think it's great if you're bilingual, and it's one of the great regrets in my life that I did not become bilingual. I think a second language enriches you as a person. From a practical perspective, we live in Ottawa, folks.
Yes,
You know,
exactly.
Language isn't an event, it's a skill. Right? That's a skill to be bilingual, and that's a saleable skill in a market like Ottawa.
This will not be the last time we discuss these issues on Top Talkers, that's for sure, being where we live. I want to thank my panel this morning for bringing up some great points. We'll be back in just a moment on CTV Morning Live.